bro shit. It's time for some gay bro shit. Get into it, gay bro shit. Let's fuck with it, gay bro shit. Hey, hi, hello, bros and hoes and theys and thems and everybody else, whatever term you use to refer to yourselves. Welcome. This is Gay Bro Shit, a podcast where I summarize and collate Wikipedia articles into new narratives. And that's a joke, but only kind of. And you can call me Dan this week because that's my name. My name is Dan. Today we're going to be covering a subject near and dear to my heart, and that is the gay bar. And I'm going to talk about the history of these spaces, how they came to be and how they grew, and more recently how they've come under threat, though you could say they've always been under threat. And I'm doing this topic because I needed a bit of a lighter subject after the heavier research episodes I've done recently. But as I did it, the script spiraled out of control and it became the longest thing that I've written yet for this show. So not really a lighter topic after all. But the other reason I'm doing this is because I owned a gay bar. So this is something I have intimate knowledge of. So I'm going to talk about what it was like to own one and also attempt to give a bit of an economics lesson about what it takes to open one and keep one going. Now, there is a lot of specific details of my experience I won't be going over because I'm still in a very protective mode when it comes to how that ended, and I have a lot of emotions tied up in that experience and the aftermath of it. But first, an announcement. I've always said from the beginning that this podcast would have a lot of interviews, and so far I haven't had a single one. But in the next few weeks, you'll hopefully start hearing the first of those. I'm also looking for guests who want to come on and talk about fitness, body image, and queer culture related topics, preferably people with a lot of lived experience or subject matter expertise, because you do know I love to research. And I just got an email address for this show, so if you are interested in being interviewed, feel free to shoot me an email at gaybrostuff@gmail.com. That's right, gaybrostuff instead of shit, which is the actual name of the show, because I didn't think Alphabet Inc. would let me have that. So gaybrostuff@gmail.com. You can also just get in touch there if you have, I don't know, corrections, feedback. You just want to tell me I'm a dirty piece of ratchet. That's totally fine. Just use that email address. And if you do want to be interviewed, just send me a message introducing yourself, give me a pitch about what you want to talk about, and hopefully I will get back to you. All right, let's talk about gay bars. First, a history lesson. As far as we know, the first gay bars, as we would now identify them, started appearing in the 1700s in a few big European cities. But before that, bars in general, or taverns, first appeared in about the 5th century BC, with some of the first stories documenting them existing in Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. But the first instances we know about with substantial documentation were in ancient Greece. Now, these bars don't look like bars do today, obviously. They simply started out as a feature of urban Greek home design, where there were usually 2 rooms at the front of the house facing the street that then could be used as like a shop or a food stall, and in some cases they sold wine. Like many things Greek, the Romans adopted this design and expanded these spaces, and tabernas were a regular feature of most Roman homes in Roman cities. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, where grapes did not grow, they instead developed ale houses that sold exclusively beer, which was made from the grains that grew in northern climates, such as most notably barley, but also rye and millet. And up until the 12th century, most people did not travel much. So these were strictly local establishments. But in the late Middle Ages, people began to be more mobile, specifically for the purposes of religious pilgrimages and later for the purposes of trade mercantilism. So a number of inns sprung up about that catered to these travelers. And these inns typically had something that looked like a bar that sold alcohol. In 1577, we get the earliest known survey of drinking establishments in Britain, and it was done for the purposes of taxation, of course. This survey recorded 14,202 alehouses, 1,631 inns, and 329 taverns. And this represents about one pub for every 187 people in Britain. And that's actually a ton of locations. And I looked up the current number of pubs per person in the UK, and it's closer to one pub for every 3,300 people. Meanwhile, here in the US, Wisconsin, which is the state with the most bars per capita, has about one bar for every 2,000 people. And New Hampshire is the state with the least bars. It has only one bar for every 65,000 people. So they had something like 10 to 30 times as many drinking establishments as a portion of the population than we do now in most of the US and in Europe, or 300 times in places like New Hampshire that don't have a lot of bars. Incidentally, Ireland and Hungary have about the same rate of bars as Wisconsin, one for every 2,000 people. So those are your drunk capitals, everyone. Ireland, Hungary, Wisconsin. But going back to the past, it seems like people were drinking a lot. Now, one of these things that we need to remember about pre-modern history is that people did not have access to clean drinking water. It really wasn't until the 1900s that most cities developed their water systems and that we understood germ theory enough to be able to guarantee water was safe to drink. But beer and wine and cider were safe because fermentation destroys bacteria. So instead of drinking water, people drank alcohol. Even children would drink beer. And even today in Germany, there is a tradition of brewing Kinder beer with a very low alcohol percentage that is potentially servable to children. Whether or not you should do that is a different question. The average medieval peasant ate an entire loaf of bread every day and drank close to a gallon of beer. So if you're a white European, there's a reason you probably love carbs and you probably love beer. And to be fair, this beer was generally lower alcohol than what we would consume today. So people weren't exactly like drunk off their fucking tits. But life was hard then. So who could really blame them if they were? Now, spirits such as vodka, whiskey, gin, brandy, tequila, etc., which are distilled, meaning they boil off a brewed beverage like a fermented mash or wine and collect the vapor to create much more concentrated beverages, these weren't really invented until later and were mostly used for medicinal purposes. Then in 1688, William of Orange brought gin to England and sparked what was called the gin craze. And during this period, poor people were increasingly consuming large quantities of gin until it became a moral panic, and Parliament ended up passing 5 different acts trying to tamp down on this problem. So that brings us up to the first known drinking spaces specifically dedicated to queer people, and that would be the so-called Molly houses of London in the 1700s. And reports of these spaces first began appearing in newspapers in the early 1720s, which means they were probably existent for at least a few years beforehand in secret. And they were called Molly houses because Molly was a slang for homosexual at the time. So really it's just a more colorful way of saying gay bar. But Molly was also slang for prostitute. And indeed, there was a lot of sex work occurring in these spaces. But as with anything this old, we really can't say how extensively. And as far as the physical spaces, often these were back rooms at bars or taverns that catered to regular patrons in the front rooms, though sometimes they were private residencies or even what we might recognize as a brothel today. So they could be as simple as a room with a keg in it or as elaborate as a brothel or a bar dedicated entirely to this clientele. The most infamous of these Molly houses was Mother Claps in Holborn, which, if you don't know London, it's sort of East Central, just to the east of the British Museum. But this bar allegedly even had security at the door, where only people who could be vouched for as sodomites were allowed entry. So it's funny to like sort of imagine what the process would be. Like, some queen comes up to the door, security is like, who are you? What's your name, pet? And then asks around the bar, hey, has anyone fucked this person? And someone in the corner is like, oh yeah, I fucked him down in the alley over there. Definitely gay, let him in. That's how that goes in my head, but sure, that's not how it actually happened. But this place, Mother Claps, was only open for 2 or 3 years before it was raided by an organization called the Society for the Reformation of Manners, which of course sounds puritanical, and it was. And the owner of the bar, Mother Clap, was put on trial along with 3 patrons who were seen engaging in acts of buggery, as it was called. And sadly, these 3 men were hanged to death because in 1533, a law came into effect called the Buggery Act that made it a crime to engage in acts of sodomy, and the punishment could be death. So these establishments needed to operate as covertly as possible to stay open and to protect their patrons, which makes it hard now to have accurate accounts of what these spaces looked like and where they were, but we do know what sort of activities occurred. Sex occurred openly, sometimes in dark corners, sometimes in private rooms, sometimes just in plain view. But there was also a large adoption of feminine mannerisms, feminine dress, using women's names in a way that we would now identify as either drag or transgender expression. There were also allegedly marriage ceremonies that occurred that seemed to express genuine commitment. And most curiously, they held mock births where a man pretending to be a woman giving birth was then assisted by other patrons dressed as midwives. And this apparently is a bit of a medieval custom that just transferred over to these spaces. These Molly houses continued to exist throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s, but there the record goes a little dark. Presumably because after the tragic consequences of the raid on Mother Claps, people were driven much more underground. And the next incident of a queer space being discovered happened in 1810 at a bar called the White Swan on Vere Street in what is now Soho. Actually, I think it was Soho at the time as well. This club had only been operating for 6 months when it was raided by the police, and 27 men were arrested. But due to bribery, only 8 of the men were eventually convicted of criminal charges, and this gets really dark, so be warned, skip ahead a little bit. 6 of the men were pilloried, meaning they were tied to a post in Haymarket Square, and the public that turned out was violent. They threw things like dead animals, fish heads, mud, rotting vegetables, and it was so unruly that 200 police constables on horseback had to be called in to control the crowds. Worse still, 2 more of the men were hanged, one of whom was only 16 years old, and neither of them had actually been at the bar that night. So early on, we're establishing this pattern of queer people being open, brazen, or just starting to express themselves publicly, only to be instantly shut down by the powers that be in extremely violent ways. Then queer people would retreat back into the shadows, and this pattern would continue even up to now. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, of course. So London had been the capital of queer nightlife, but slowly Paris began to overtake London as the post-revolutionary society in France was much more open than it was in the UK. In fact, sodomy had been decriminalized in 1791, so in Paris it was possible to be queer without the threat of arrest. I couldn't find specifics, but the areas around Montmartre and Les Halles were My French is terrible. That's fine. We're home to a variety of gay businesses, including bars, cafes, and even bathhouses. And I also need to note that lesbian culture specifically took off in Paris with a long list of famous women who loved women. And this was not something that we saw happening in London in the previous century. And artists like Oscar Wilde escaped to Paris where they could live in relative freedom. Notably, Wilde had been put on trial in 1895 in the UK for gross indecency, basically for being gay. So people were seeking out Paris as a refuge, as a safe haven. So then we get the first known gay bar, meaning the first one that was brazenly and openly marketed as an establishment for gay men. And that happens not in Paris, but actually in Cannes on the Riviera. And the name of this bar was Zanzibar. And it was opened in 1885. And it was actually open for 125 years, only closing in 2010. And knowing this now, I really wish I had a chance to visit it, but of course I did not, because I did not know it existed. Simultaneously, by the 1900s, gay bars had started to pop up in Amsterdam and most notably in Berlin. Berlin, in particular, saw an explosion of creativity and nightlife in the 1920s, with one club named El Dorado being famous specifically for its drag shows. And the queer cabaret scene in Berlin gave birth to legendary actress Marlene Dietrich. And this was the world that was depicted by English writer Christopher Isherwood, and his work was later turned into a stage play and then the iconic musical and movie Cabaret. Meanwhile, in good old America, nothing much was happening because unfortunately at this time we had the rise of the temperance movement, which sought to outlaw alcohol completely. And they succeeded in 1920 with the passing of the 18th Amendment, which put prohibition of alcohol into the Constitution. Canada passed a similar prohibition in 1918, but it didn't last as long, it was overturned in 1920, and this is sort of how we ended up smuggling lots of Canadian booze into the U.S. But obviously there were no bars during this time legally, so we didn't get gay bars when they were being developed in Europe. Prohibition then ended in 1933, which is not coincidentally, the very same year that some of the earliest gay bars in the U.S. open, including the Black Cat Bar in San Francisco, the Double Header in Seattle, which I believe is still open, the White Horse in Oakland, and Cafe Lafitte in Exile in New Orleans, which is definitely still open. Love me some napkin toss. Now, there is one bar in the United States that predates all of these, but only unofficially, and that is the famous Atlantic House in Provincetown, Massachusetts, also known locally as the A House. And the A House was not officially a gay bar until much later, but in the 1920s, it became a de facto gay bar when people like Tennessee Williams began summering in Provincetown and using the bar as their hangout in town. But the clientele was always a mix of local fishermen, mostly Portuguese, and artists from out of town seeking refuge from the rest of the world, many of whom were actually straight. So 1933 was the end of Prohibition in America, but 1933 was also the year that the Nazis came to power in Germany. So while the earliest gay bars were opening in the States, the gay bars of Berlin were closing. 14 Berlin establishments closed within a few weeks of the Nazis taking over the government. And the Nazis swept across Western Europe, invading both Amsterdam and Paris in 1940. And for a while, this was the end of the gay bar in the major cities of Europe. And the Nazis imprisoned many thousands of homosexuals, and we don't know the exact number of people that were murdered in concentration camps, but the best estimate is that it's somewhere around 10,000 people were executed for being queer. And I said this was going to be a lighter episode, and so far it's definitely not, but we can't talk about any aspect of queer history without talking about queer oppression, and ignoring this would be dishonest and irresponsible. So World War II put a damper on the development of queer spaces, and people, except it kind of didn't, because what happened is that men who were drafted into service found themselves in the close company of other men. Particularly the Navy developed a bit of a sort of reputation for being a hotbed for gay men because of the realities of living on a ship and spending months in tight spaces surrounded exclusively by other men. So during the war, and in particular after, a lot of these men ended up in coastal port cities such as San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, etc., where they would then be drawn to the covert queer spaces operating at the time. I should also mention at the time, gay bars were beginning to spring up in other places. Mexico City had a burgeoning gay scene beginning in the 30s, and by World War II, there were apparently 15 gay bars in the city. The first gay bar in South Africa opened in Johannesburg in the late 40s and catered exclusively to white men, as you might expect. In Canada, Montreal actually had the first gay business in all of North America, and it was an apple and cake shop established in 1869, which is so fucking cute, and I really want a gay apple and cake shop, please. And by the late 1960s, the bar scenes had developed in all of Canada's biggest city. In Japan, the occupation by Americans after the war led to an opening up of society, with a gay tea shop opening in 1948 in Tokyo, and by 1966, Tokyo had its first gay bar. And today, Tokyo is the city in the world with the most gay bars, with over 300 just in the one main area of Shinjuku. And now most of these bars are quite small, often seating like 12 people, so these bars have become highly specialized in subcultures. Speaking of subcultures, in Amsterdam, we got the very first leather bar in 1955, and I couldn't find the name of this bar, though, so I'm not sure what it was called. In the States, we get our first leather bar, the Gold Coast, in Chicago in 1958, and that was followed by the Toolbox in San Francisco in 1961. As always, I love the names of these old bars. In New York, a longshoreman bar called the Eagle's Nest slowly morphed into a leather bar catering to gay men, eventually changing its name to just the Eagle in 1970. And that name would soon become a generic moniker for leather bar that just spread all over the world, with up to 50 gay bars using the name the Eagle at one point in time. Now, we haven't talked about New York much, but you'll note that the year the Eagle became a gay bar as 1970 as significant. And that is, of course, because the Stonewall riots occurred in 1969, and they occurred outside a gay bar. And now, this episode is not about Stonewall, but just to give you a quick summary, New York City bars were generally owned and run by the mob, and they were raided frequently by police. The mob would pay off the police, an act hilariously named Gayola, but the bars were still routinely raided once a month on average, and patrons were rounded up, harassed, arrested. In the early 1960s, then Mayor Robert Wagner Jr. led a full-on campaign trying to rid the city of its gay bars in preparation for the 1964 World's Fair, itself a very gay event. There's fucking Disney rides at the World's Fair. That's gay. For the bars themselves, the State Liquor Control Commission had the right to revoke the license of any bar for any reason, and this was often wielded as a weapon against bars catering to queer people, which unfortunately is still happening in 2024. So on the night of June 28th, 1969, the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan was raided, but this time, rather than being compliant, the patrons dressed as women refused to go into the bathroom to have their sex checked by a female police officer. And then the patrons dressed as men reacted by refusing to give the police their IDs. The police then brought in patrol wagons to try and round up people to bring them into the station. But as they did this, word had spread throughout the neighborhood, and at least 100 other people had gathered outside. The patrons were put into handcuffs and one by one led into the wagons waiting outside, but it was allegedly a butch lesbian who incited the riot by yelling at the crowd, "Why don't you do something?" And so they did. The crowd had grown to 500 or more people at this point, and they started throwing things like beer bottles. And most famously, they picked up bricks from a local construction site and started hurling those at the police as well. And nobody knows who initiated this. And there are lots of legends about who threw the first brick, but the truth is nobody knows. We just know that almost certainly it was a butch lesbian woman who kicked off the thing by inciting the crowd. And what's more is that nobody really knows why it was this particular raid on this particular night that resulted in a riot. As we said before, the average bar in New York was raided at least once a month. So why this raid and this day? And multiple participants reported there was no one cause and that it sort of erupted spontaneously. Later on, it became legend that the riots erupted on that particular night because of the death of queer icon Judy Garland some 6 days prior, and because her funeral had been 2 nights before. But none of the participants seemed to corroborate this connection. It's more likely that the queer people in attendance had just watched or even participated in the civil rights movements and the anti-war movements that had developed over the previous decade, and that this was a natural outcrop of the push for greater freedoms and the rejection of systems of oppression. Following Stonewall, we get a coordinated gay liberation movement in the United States, and we see an explosion of gay bars and gay neighborhoods in the United States and other countries. By 1980, there were more than 1,000 gay bars in the United States, with 200 of them alone being lesbian bars. And the number of bars continued to grow into the 1980s and peaked in 1987 at more than 1,700 bars. One type of bar I really want to talk about, though, is the rise of the cruise bar, or bars where having sex was the main draw of the establishment. And there's an amazing documentary called Gay Sex in the 70s that highlights this period of time, and it's free online to watch with a library card. And I had intended to rewatch this, but I cannot reset my library account password, so whoops. Anyway, by the late 70s, there were a ton of bars dedicated specifically to sex, with names like the Anvil, the Ramrod, the Mineshaft, and this world was also depicted in the infamous 1980 Al Pacino movie Cruising. And what I find interesting personally is that these bars no longer really exist in the United States, but in Europe, they're everywhere. There are a number of bars in most big cities that are effectively a small bar area surrounded by a dark maze for cruising. And big clubs like XXL in London have massive cruising areas that take up like a fourth of the floor space. And this is not to say that people don't have sex in bars in America, but there's usually no dedicated space for this type of activity, or it's discouraged or outright prohibited. And I have thoughts and theories, and we'll get to them. But first, something catastrophic happens to derail the decade of progress that occurred in the 70s. And that thing is, of course, the AIDS crisis. The first cases appeared in 1981 in New York and San Francisco and some other cities. But what we didn't know was that the virus had already been quietly circulating for years. We believe now that the virus entered the United States sometime in the 1950s via Haiti. And there is a documented case of someone with AIDS-like symptoms dying in the year 1969. But because the virus can live for 10 or more years within the body before presenting symptoms, many people had no idea they were already infected, and it's estimated that by 1978, 5% of gay men living in New York and San Francisco had been infected already. As the virus spread and more gay men and other queer people became sick, the gay bar started to lose its patrons, and many closed during this time period. According to a survey of listings done in Slate, San Francisco saw the number of gay bars in total drop from 118 in 1973 to 92 in 1984, and then a further drop to 57 near the height of the epidemic in 1989. In Manhattan, there were 86 gay bars in 1978 and only 41 in 1989. So in both cases, in both cities, the number of bars dropped by more than half. So naturally, the cruising bar is one of the big casualties as the convergence of moral policing by the community itself and the literal policing by public health departments made it difficult to operate these spaces. And that's a legacy we still have today. Now, this same Slate survey actually showed something interesting when it came to other cities or localities. In the 3 other locations they looked at, which were Seattle, Atlanta, and Iowa, the state, not a city, the number of open bars remained fairly flat between 1973 and 2011. But since the study was done in 2011, I wanted to look at 2024. So I turned to the website Gay Cities for their listings because it's the closest approximation to what the article used for their study, which was the Gay Yellow Pages, which no longer exists as far as I can tell, or at least not online. So in the case of Seattle, there were 12 open bars in 2011, but I counted 15 in 2024, so a slight increase. In Atlanta, there were 22 open bars in 2011 and 18 in 2024, so a very slight decrease. And I wasn't able to get a good count for Iowa, but doing a Google Map search, it looks like there's about the same number of bars there as well. Finally, since, as we said, the Slate data ends in 2011, I thought I would follow up with New York and San Francisco as well. So in 2011, Manhattan had 44 bars, and in 2024, I count 53. So a decent possible increase there. Of course, there are also now more bars in Brooklyn and the outer boroughs, so it may be that things are actually looking up there. In 2011, San Francisco had 33 bars, and in 2024, Gay Cities lists 71. However, cruising through these listings, a lot of them actually look like mixed bars or bars that have gay nights once in a while, so the real number is probably closer to 40. So again, like pretty flat, but not anything dire as far as like this massive die-off of the bar. That being said, in spite of these numbers I just gave, it does feel like bars are closing left, right, and center. But the gay bars that have been hit the hardest are bars catering to lesbian and people of color. So according to an article in the Washington Post, between 2007 and 2019, the number of all gay bars declined by 37%, but the number of lesbian bars declined by 52%, and the number of bars catering to people of color declined by 59%. And a lot of people have been quick to point to the rise of the internet and hookup apps as a replacement for the bar. The theory being that if people can find sex in other ways, they'll skip going to the bar. But I think some other things are happening that negatively impact the gay bar business. A big factor is the rise in commercial rents, which, while less extreme than the rise in residential rates, is still out of line with inflation. And I've heard of stories of bars in major coastal cities having their rents doubled or even tripled when the lease is put up for renewal. But a big thing we do need to talk about is that people are drinking less. In 2001, 72% of people under the age of 35 reported drinking, but by 2023, it had dropped to 62%. And the number of people in the same age group who had reported having at least one drink per week declined from 67% to 61%. During the same time period, marijuana usage doubled in the same age group. So it looks like people are increasingly turning to weed instead. That's certainly been my own personal experience. One factor might be that our attitudes towards how drinking affects our health have changed. In the recent past, we were told that drinking socially was actually good for your health, but now pretty much all of the research indicates that any amount of alcohol is unhealthy. And in particular, a lot of the gays who are hyper-focused on fitness aren't drinking very much, partly because there's a perception that alcohol is just empty calories. And this set of people is more likely to turn to other substances when they want to party, like MDMA or GHB or ketamine or cocaine or meth. And as a side note here, Alcohol does have calories, but we're not sure how our body utilizes these calories and if it's comparable to food sources. We do know that if you consume no or little food and large quantities of alcohol, your body seems to adjust and use the alcohol like it would food. So theoretically, alcohol is not a preferred energy source, but will do in an emergency. But there's no ethical way to study this on living humans, so it's an unresolved question. In the past, a lot of people in general, but in particular queer people, use alcohol as a form of self-medication, and this was considered socially acceptable as long as these people were still able to function in society. In my experience, people in the upper and upper middle classes are still often drinking in excess, but it's magically not a problem because they're drinking wine, craft beer, high-end liquors like cognac, aged whiskeys, single malt scotches, etc., and they're consuming them at home. And I once had a friend refer to this as upper middle class drinking, and it stuck with me how a behavior that would be considered problematic for the working poor or unhoused is suddenly okay when somebody has disposable income and a place to live. And I say this as someone who was a functional alcoholic for a chunk of my 20s and was surrounded by friends and coworkers who have the same behaviors. And in terms of self-medication, though life is still hard for many queer people, it's certainly gotten easier for a lot of us, particularly those of us who are cisgendered. And when you watch older depictions of gay men, such as the play The Boys in the Band, there's often a character of a self-loathing homosexual who becomes a drunk to cope. Whereas in 2024, a lot of us have the luxury of existing without being under the constant threat of violence or oppression, although it sure doesn't seem like that's going to last. We've also gotten much more accepting of mental health treatments and open about medication usage and therapy. So we have other outlets for emotions. Even just having social media to vent is an alternative outlet. Another factor is that alcohol has become more expensive. If the average drink costs $10 or more, that's going to limit the number of drinks you might be able to afford to consume. Meanwhile, here in Oregon, marijuana retails for $4 per gram. So it offers a significantly better value proposition because you don't have to spend a lot of money to get high and stay high, whereas you do have to spend a decent amount of money to get a buzz and significantly more money to continue that buzz. Another factor is how we feel about social interactions post-pandemic. When we were all shut inside with limited opportunities to socialize, it was assumed that when the pandemic was over, there would be a lot of pent-up demand, and we would see something akin to the Roaring '20s in this decade, in this century. But that has not materialized. What seems to have happened instead is that a lot of people got into the habit of staying home and just never got out of it again. And I've also observed that parties are petering out earlier, and bars that used to close at 2 a.m. or later are closing at midnight because people just aren't going out that late. When I ran my bar in 2021-2022, we were rarely open after 1 a.m. because people just wanted to go home before then. For lesbian bars in particular, but to some extent, any bar that labels itself a gay bar, I think one issue has been the shift in the wording we use to identify ourselves and the sort of groups we feel comfortable being around. The lesbian label, used historically to talk about cis women who exclusively date and sleep with other cis women, is one that a lot of queer femmes have moved away from. People who in the past might have identified as a butch lesbian are now coming out as non-binary or transmasculine, and they're often dating other non-binary or transmasculine people, and so the word lesbian is no longer an appropriate descriptor. Similarly, bars that have traditionally catered exclusively to gay men are now finding they need to expand their audience or risk having a shrinking pool of customers. I think about the Leather Bar here in my town that has recently hired a woman bartender and regularly books trans femmes to host events. And in our cities, another phenomenon has emerged, and that is that more and more bars that are not explicitly gay bars are hanging up rainbow flags in the window and throwing events that would normally be the domain of gay bars, like drag shows. And if you go on Google Maps and search for the term gay bar in a particular city, you will see a listing for bars that aren't actually gay bars, but merely gay friendly. So if all of a sudden every bar is potentially a gay bar with the right event, or at the very least presents itself as a safe space for queer people, then we can start to question if we need dedicated queer spaces. On a related note, in a lot of cities, bars and other businesses used to be heavily concentrated into one area affectionately known as the gayborhood or the gay ghetto. And while some of the bigger cities definitely still have these, in other places, the forces of gentrification have swept in and scattered what was there. Here in Portland, we used to have an ultra compact area called the Stark Street Triangle, where there were something like 8 or so bars on a 3-block stretch. And these bars supported other businesses like an all-night diner, a leather star, a coffee house, a bagel place, a bathhouse. Then in the early 2000s, the area just north of that underwent a massive redevelopment project that transformed like 40 blocks of what had formerly been warehouses and industrial spaces into condos and high-end retail. The Whole Foods moved in, the Patagonia store, the West Elm, and sure enough, over the next few years, all of the gay businesses were pushed out except one. The bathhouse became a boutique hotel. One bar became a ramen shop. Another became a jeans store, and so on. But if I do a count of the bars we have in the city, we actually have as many now as we've had at any other point in the city's history, and even more now than we did during the glory days of Stark Street and all the bars on the one street. But the bars have become a diaspora all around the city with several miles in between each of them. In downtown, there are still 4 bars that are within walking distance to each other, but getting between any of the other bars in the city requires a car. So on the one hand, it's nice that most areas of the cities have a gay bar within a few miles, but we don't benefit from the bar hopping that can happen in places where there are a lot of businesses in proximity. When we had a gayborhood, it's easy to just kind of meet up at one bar with your friends and just see where the night takes you, whereas that's less possible when the bars are spattered out. You have to actually plan on how you're going to get between places. Another thing that seems to have happened, and this is the final thing I'll touch on here, is that there is a group of young people who came of age during the pandemic who don't really know how to go out. And I've observed some really weird behavior from young people who don't seem to understand how to order a drink, what they like to drink, how to tip. And it's as though all of these sort of experiential knowledge that has been traditionally passed down from slightly older people to slightly younger people just sort of skipped all these people because they were inside and they missed their window, and now just aren't going to get that information unless someone yells at them. And that's just an observation based on my experience working at 2 bars in one city. But people in their early 20s have always been a key driver in nightlife. So perhaps this is a developing potential issue, that we have a group of people in their prime drinking age who are just not interested, or not doing it in a way that benefits the bars. So now I'm going to go over the expenses that go into opening and running a bar that will hopefully explain why drinks cost what they do and why going out has become so expensive. And I'm going to base this off businesses that I have experience with, including my own, and in the places that I've lived. So certainly there are other possible economic realities for businesses in other places that might really reduce the expenses required. So the cheapest way to open a bar is to actually buy an existing bar that is already open and making money. If the business doesn't own its real estate, meaning it rents, then the business sale price is usually going to be something like the equivalent of 1 to 2 years of net revenue. And that's because with a lease in place, it's assumed that the business is only guaranteed to be open and making money for the length of the lease. Now, most leases are renewed, but you still don't really know that. So you're only buying the possibility of making money for a period of years. So the price of the business could be as low as the price of a new car if the business isn't making a ton of money. It could also be upwards of several $1,000,000 if the place is big and well established. But it's not unrealistic to buy an operating business for a similar price as a down payment on a decently nice house in your area. If the business owns the building and or the land beneath it, now that price gets factored into the purchase price because you have a fixed asset that retains its value regardless of how successful the business occupying it is. And sometimes you can find a bar space that is just sort of sitting empty and fully built out for lease. And this is how I was able to start the bar that I owned. I found a bar space that was fully equipped, even had things like glassware and a little bit of liquor left. And I opened my bar in 2021 in a space that had been a bar for a few decades, but the most recent business was struggling during COVID and, of course, decided to close down. And in the summer of 2021, COVID looked like it was over, so it felt like a great idea at the time. But of course, you may need to remodel and replace equipment and whatnot, so you can potentially spend tens of thousands of dollars modifying an existing space just to meet your needs. And if that space has previously had a similar business that failed, you should probably be prepared to do a lot of critical thinking as to what factors might have gone into that business not succeeding. By far the most expensive option is to build a bar out from scratch. Depending on where you are, designing and building out a bar can cost anywhere from like $200,000 on the very low end to up to $2.5 million on the high end. And the average bar and restaurant build out is currently about $400 per square foot. So a fairly average 3,000 square foot bar could cost $1.2 million on average to build. And while the space is under construction, you're still going to be responsible for paying the rent and the utilities and any other fixed costs, even while the business isn't making any money. Another hassle you'll encounter is acquiring a liquor license. On the extreme end, in the city of Boston, there is only a limited number of full licenses available. And in most areas, they have already given out all of the licenses they're going to give out. So the only way to acquire a liquor license is to buy one at auction from a business that is closing. And so you can spend anywhere from $400,000 to $1 million just buying a liquor license at auction. Now, here in Oregon, where I live and where I own my bar, the liquor license costs less than $1,000, but there are a ton of requirements around the person who owns the bar so that anyone with a criminal record, specifically a drug or alcohol-related offense, is going to have a really hard time getting approved. Another difficulty I encountered is that the liquor authority consults with the police department, and a license can be denied based on the crime rate in the particular area close to the bar. And so my liquor license was initially denied by the police department because there had been too much crime in that area in the preceding 18 months. An 18-month period where the city faced an escalating housing crisis on the account of a pandemic, shutting down shelter beds and driving people onto the street, and a summer of civil unrest over the violent actions of the police towards Black and brown people. So that was a wildly unfair thing for the police to look at the crime in the downtown area and say there's too much crime already. You can't have a liquor license when a lot of the crime was being caused by them. Now, the liquor license authority was able to grant me the license because they used different crime statistics to determine their final approval. But this is a lot of power to place in the hands of the Police and Liquor Control Commission. And if crime is being used as a way to deny people the ability to open a bar, I can only imagine that the potential exists within the system to discriminate against bars that are owned by and cater to people of color, because these are often in more crime-prone areas and because the crime exists, because of systemic factors that are beyond their control. And I also know of stories via a lawyer friend of mine who was working on a case actively suing the Liquor Licensing Authority. And In this case, and in others, they found that the liquor licensing authority was used as a way to shut down existing businesses if crime was occurring in the vicinity. And they could just vaguely blame that crime on the bar. And so there's a few cases where this was used in the state, and all of these bars that had been shut down for this reason were owned by and catering to people of color. So liquor licensing can be used to reinforce white supremacy and deny people of color the right to own and operate businesses. So maybe this is why there are less gay bars owned by and catering to people of color. And just a month ago, gay bars in Seattle, which is not in Oregon, but in Washington State, which is the state next door, were targeted by a task force made up of the police, the liquor authority, and the fire department. And 2 bars were issued fines because at one bar, a staff member had an exposed nipple, and at the other bar, a patron had a visible jockstrap peeking above the waist of their pants. So why the fuck does the liquor authority in Washington State have the power to police people's bodies? That's because of the archaic nature of the liquor statutes, but there was a substantial backlash to this, and in the end, the fines ended up being dropped, and the liquor authority in Washington is now saying that they're not going to enforce whatever archaic statutes they had been using against patrons' dress. And so I think this is why we don't see cruising spaces in U.S. bars anymore, because liquor licenses are either controlled by the police force or a state or local authority that kowtows to the police. Even in Oregon, where it's fully legal to be naked in public, we can be naked in a bar, but we can't engage in any sort of sexual activity or be visibly aroused legally. And bars that don't comply can have their liquor licenses pulled, and then they're shit out of luck because they now have no longer have a way to make money to survive. Another big expense up front is going to be insurance. With all of the various coverages required, it's like 10 different things that are required, 10 different little small packages. My insurance was $30,000 for the year, and they usually want all of that money up front. And it's usually done by how big the bar is, how many people you are going to see, where you're located, etc. So that was $30,000 a year for like a 3,000 square foot space. So we're potentially talking about a lot more money. And generally speaking, you can't get a liquor license without insurance. And so it's a condition of final approval that you obtain a policy and pay for it first. Now let's talk about rent. As I alluded to before, unlike apartments, commercial rents are usually priced by square foot per year, and that cost gets broken down monthly. So meaning in my city, Portland, the average retail space is going for between $18 and $25 per square foot per year. And then that total amount gets divided by 12 months. So our 3,000 square foot bar is going to cost between $54,000 and $75,000 a year to rent. Or in the equivalent monthly rental, that would be between $4,500 and $6,200 a month. Now, we are not a cheap city, but we're probably just a little above average when it comes to commercial leases. Bars in smaller cities or even suburban or rural locations may pay as low as $10 per year per square foot. On the other side, in San Francisco, I'm seeing commercial rents that range up to $100 per square foot. Now, I did conveniently find an available bar space right on Castro Street listed at $30 per square foot. Now, that space is 6,000 square feet. But going back to our example, our 3,000 square foot bar is now going to cost between $90,000 and $290,000 to rent. In New York, I'm seeing rents in the $80 to $200 per square foot per year range. And it's funny because on the first page of my search, I saw a listing for a space in the bottom floor of the apartment building I lived in on the Upper West Side, going for $190 per square foot per year. So our 3,000 square foot gay bar is going to be between $240,000 and $600,000 a year. So in all here, we get a range for our example bar of 3,000 square feet of $30,000 in rent a year to $600,000 in rent per year. So location is absolutely going to play a factor in your expenses. Your next biggest expense, and probably your biggest recurring expense after opening, is going to be staffing, but this completely depends on where you are. For example, in Europe, where bar staff generally don't receive substantial tips, they receive a higher hourly wage, anywhere from like the equivalent of $10 to $15 an hour. I've read in Australia, it can be closer to $25 an hour, but I can't confirm that. If anyone out there knows, just let me know. In the US, how much you pay your staff is going to depend on what state you're in. In most states, you are allowed to pay tipped employees less than the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, meaning in these states, if you make more than a few dollars an hour in tips, then they can pay you a lower hourly rate to compensate, as low as $2.13 an hour. So if you're in one of these places, your wage bill might be very low aside from any management staff. And as an employee, basically what happens is you end up owing money in taxes at the end of the year because your hourly wages isn't enough to cover any taxes you would need to pay on those tips. Here on the West Coast, employees still receive the state minimum wage, which is between $11 and more than $16 an hour. So 11 in Nevada, in Oregon, it's up to $15.75, and then it's a little bit more than 16 in Washington, near Seattle. Also on the West Coast, any bar with a full liquor license is also required to sell food. Some places will have a bartender dish out some hot dogs or pizza and call it a day. Others will have more elaborate menus, and a lot of bars have full kitchens that require multiple staff members to run. And the going rate for kitchen staff is usually at least $18 an hour. Side note, some bars try and get away with this by having frozen Hungry Man dinners or banquet meals that they can pop in the microwave and charge an exorbitant amount of money for so that nobody orders them. So I've heard, allegedly. That is totally not allowed, but they do it anyway. Because turns out once you open your bar, it seems like they don't really recheck if you're serving food. Hot tip, how to get away with something. You then also have to factor in about 20 or so percentage on top of these wages in payroll taxes and other local taxes. So now it's clear that having customary tipping is a way to have employers pass the cost of their labors directly onto the customers. So we can all sit around and debate whether this system should exist or not. But I will say that for somebody who has bartended on and off for years, the system of tipping does really incentivize hard work because how much you can make is directly tied to how fast you can be. I mentioned those hourly wages. So Australia, with that hourly wage of 25, me on an average night as a tipped bartender is making $35 an hour on a slow night and up to $50 or even $60 on a really good night. And there's certainly people who make more than that. So consequently, because the staff are working harder, a smaller staff can serve more people because they're more productive per person. And this system is good for providing part-time employment for a lot of artists and creatives who can work part-time at a bar and afford to pay their bills and have more time for their other pursuits. And I'm saying this as somebody who's literally doing this right now. I make more money bartending part-time than I was at my last 2 salary jobs. And I still have time to do a research-intensive podcast, make music, work out 5 times a week, and still have somewhat of a social life. Another expense we're going to run into is utilities. So electricity for all of our bar coolers, our lights, our music systems, our air conditioning, gas for our kitchen equipment, and water. Tons and tons of water. Your toilets are flushing all day long and dishwashers are being constantly cycled. Our water bill could be more than $1,000 and our electricity bill was usually around $500 a month. Surprisingly, gas was only like $50 a month because we just didn't have too many pieces of equipment in the kitchen kitchen that used it, but it could obviously be more if you have a much bigger kitchen. You also have to pay for internet and phone, and you have to pay for a music license fee and any cable fees. So if you have televisions that you want to screen Drag Race on and whatever the kids are into these days, you're going to have to pay for that, and you're going to have to pay for it more than you would at home. On that note, you will also need to pay for your entertainment. Justifiably, DJs, KJs, event hosts, musicians, drag performers all need to be paid for their work and for the people that they bring into the space. Booking fees depend on the level of the person you're booking, but it might be as low as $100 for a new DJ to several $1,000s for a big name, or up to $10,000 for the latest Drag Race winner. By far, the most annoying expense you're going to encounter is repairs and maintenance. For example, my walk-in refrigerator died and it costs $3,000 to replace the condenser that makes it cold. And then 3 months later, another part dies and you're out another $1,000. Or just before I opened the bar, the water heater that fed into my dishwasher died and sprung a leak and flooded the business on the floor below. So I had to pay $3,000 to replace the water heater, plus another $2,000 in electrical and plumbing installation, and another $1,000 to cover the damages to the space below. Or there was a time I needed to get a new fire shutoff valve installed on my gas pipes and was quoted at $50,000 for the work, which I never got done because obvious reasons. Or let's say the multiple broken windows that needed to be replaced at $1,000 a pop. And because these things are random by nature, the only thing you can do is just keep putting money aside just in case. And of course, you may not have that money to put aside, so something like this could turn into a complete catastrophe for a business operating on very thin margins. And of course, you also have to pay for everything you sell. A bottle of well liquor might run you only $5 or $6, but most of your bottles are going to cost between $20 and $30, with premiums going much higher. Of course, you can get showcase bottles that cost several $100s and rarely get ordered, but brings sort of a certain prestige to having them. And ideally, you'll get close to 20 drinks out of a bottle, but if you've got staff that like to pour heavy, which happens all the time in gay bars, then maybe you'll get 10 to 12 drinks out of a bottle. But you also have to pay for everything else that goes into the drink glass. So mixers cost between 10 and 30 cents an ounce. Straws can cost several cents each. Ice costs money. Any garnishes. And of course, the glass or plastic cup that you put the drink into. And all of these small costs can add up. And so on average, it takes between $1 to $3 to make a drink. And most bars aim for something like a 20% margin, meaning all the costs that go into the drink should be 20% of whatever it's sold for. But a bar I used to work at in Provincetown was able to sell for closer to 10%. And on the other hand, some dive bars with low prices might be closer to a 30% margin or even higher. And on paper, we, the consumers, see these markups and think, damn, that's ridiculous that I'm paying $10 for a drink that costs $2 to make. But now that you have an idea of all of the money that goes into opening and running a bar, you can hopefully see why these things cost what they do. Because unless a bar is just a toy for a rich owner who can afford to lose a bunch of money, then you actually need to make money to stay open. As alluded to, the number one way to make money is by selling drinks. In some bars, this is the only way they make money. So as a simple example, we have a bar in an inexpensive area that needs about $20,000 a month to stay open and to pay all of the bills. So that means that we need to do $24,000 in drink sales because we also have to cover the cost that goes into those drinks. So at an average cost of $8 a drink, we need to sell 3,000 drinks a month. And that sounds doable, as it's only about 100 drinks per night. And these days, the average patron is consuming about 2 drinks. Some obviously consume more, and then there are other people who will only have a Diet Coke, so that averages out to about 2 drinks per person. This means we need to get 50 people through the door on on average just to break even, which isn't crazy, but it might be hard to do on a Monday or Tuesday, or if it's raining, or if it's snowing, or if it's really hot, or if there's a big event going on somewhere else, like Pride in the next city down the road, or I don't know, if it's the end of the month and rent is due for a lot of people, or if it's summer in a college town, or if it's winter in a beach town, or if there's a global pandemic. Now, the bar in our example was cheap to operate, but we can scale this up as a basic model. So a bar that costs $50,000 a month to stay open will need to sell 200 or more drinks and see 100 people a day on average just to break even. Or they might just need to charge more per drink to compensate. So what are some other ways we can make money aside from alcohol? Well, we can charge people a cover to get in. And this, of course, only works if people think that whatever you're offering is worth paying for. A bar in Manhattan with a big drag show might get away with charging $20 to get in, but try charging even $5 to get into a mid-sized city bar on a weeknight, and people will just laugh at you and go somewhere else. And the main thing that a cover charge does is offset your entertainment and security costs. Only in the busiest tourist destinations during the height of season will this probably be a substantial source of revenue. We can also try and get people to spend more money by selling food, but from my experience and from talking to other bar owners, even at bars with really good food programs, at most 20% of their sales even come from food. So it's often kind of just a loss leader in the sense that having food might get some more people in the door, and it's hopefully getting them to buy more drinks, which is where you actually make your money back. And making food costs much more than making drinks. Usually it's closer to 50% of the cost for a food item that go into the ingredients and preparation versus 10 to 20% for our drinks. Finally, if you're lucky, you might live somewhere where gambling can legally occur in a bar. Here in Oregon, it's legal for a bar to have up to 6 slot machines. And having seen the financials of some bars that have had it, in some cases, those 6 machines are generating $100,000 or more a year in extra revenue. And that might be the only thing keeping the place open. And this opens up a big conversation about ethics, because when it comes to gambling, we know that a small portion of the population with a compulsion to gamble are the ones doing a majority of the gambling. And these are often the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And we can also have this same conversation about the ethics of selling alcohol as well, as we have no idea whether the people we are selling to are addicted or not. And we don't know what potential harm we might be causing by selling them alcohol. So all in all, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the bar open, and then tens of thousands of dollars to keep it running every month. And what sucks about this is that the only people who can afford to open a bar are people who have money from inherited wealth or success in other highly lucrative fields like real estate, technology, medical. And if you know anything about people with a lot of money, you know that these people are often really boring, dull, uncreative people. And now they're the ones in charge of deciding what happens in our nightlife spaces because they're the only ones that can afford to do so. Of course, many people without a ton of money are able to make things work, and I was lucky and privileged enough to be one of these people for a brief period of time. So the highly condensed version of my story is this. I've been bartending on and off since I was 19, and I've been going to queer clubs since I was 15, and I've also been a drag performer on and off since I was 21, and I spent summers working on Fire Island and Provincetown, in addition to traveling all over the world. So I've seen more queer nightlife and spaces than most people will in several lifetimes. And then I add in the fact that I have a business degree and 6 years of running a local gym chain, and it felt a bit like an inevitability that at some point I would eventually try and create a queer space. And Like so many people, the pandemic was a great reckoning where I found myself with a lot of time to sit around and think and dream. And I decided I was no longer content to just occupy other people's visions of queer nightlife and run other people's businesses. And perhaps most critically, I had money that family members were willing to invest into me and my vision. And without this, nothing would have ever happened, which is where my privilege absolutely plays a factor. So in the spring of 2021, when it looked like the pandemic would be waning with the rollout of the vaccine, I began looking for a space. And sometime around Memorial Day, I found a vacant bar listed on Craigslist of all places. And I toured the space and was immediately interested in making it work. And I drafted a business plan and began talks with the landlord. And all of that summer, it looked like the pandemic was over and people were back out on the streets and people were going to bars. And I was able to sign the lease in late summer and I began the liquor license application. As I mentioned before, this process did not go smoothly. And so after 2 months of waiting for a license, I was told by someone that I might not be able to get one, or that it might have been at least 6 months till I could get one. And I'd already put in months of work and thousands of dollars at this point. So this was obviously devastating. And I spent the next week or so desperately scrambling for solutions. But a miracle happened and the liquor license was granted 2 weeks later in late October. So now I went from possibly not being able to open for 6 months or maybe never being able to open to being able to open immediately. So I shifted into hyperdrive to get the space open and get my staff in place. And from here on, the whole thing just sort of becomes a wild blur of intense emotions and crises after unanticipated crises. And the least of all crises was that in the fall of 2021, just as we were getting ready to open, we experienced another wave of COVID and everyone stopped going out again. Now, we limped through the winter, but by spring we were able to fulfill the vision of having a truly inclusive space with an awesome roster of shows and entertainment. And I had between 8 and 12 shows a week. Like at one point I was providing about 40% of all the paid drag gigs in the entire city. More critically for me, I was able to give myself a space to do the shows that I wanted to do because I didn't have to pay myself and I was able to experiment. I had a weekly show where I just occupied the stage and sang whatever songs I felt like doing that week, including all of the songs that I was writing for myself. And that by far is the thing that I miss the most. And I may never have the opportunity to do that again. And that is a profound loss for me. I'm not going to lie. But I was proud of what we were able to put on. And I was proud of my staff. And almost every member of my staff was a performer, and half of them were trans or non-binary. Half of my bartenders were female presenting. And most importantly, the queer people who didn't feel safe anywhere else felt safe in my space. And so many times people would find out that I was the owner and just thank me genuinely for providing this space and this experience for them. And most memorably, one night we had a trans woman propose to her lesbian girlfriend on our smoking patio because, in her words, this was the first place they ever truly felt safe outside of their own homes. And that was all incredible, but the business never made any money. And we did everything we could, and still just could not get the business required just to break even. And my only option was to keep finding more money. And if you've ever had to scramble for money over and over again desperately, you know how emotionally draining this can be. This is the reality for most poor people. Meanwhile, the stress of this whole thing had already put me in the hospital once for, we'll just say, severe mental health problems. And I just wasn't willing to push myself that close to the edge again. So eventually I ran out of places to get money, and I did the incredibly difficult thing of closing the business. And that was beyond devastating. And I spent the next 6 months basically in hiding. And I'm still not over it now, a year and a half later, but I'm moving in that direction. And I know I'm skipping a lot of details, especially all of the trials and tribulations that happened while we were open, and the staff members I had to fire, and the producers who became problematic, and the people who tried to come for me on the internet. But maybe I don't want to share all that stuff and keep it to myself, like a little goblin hoarding treasures under their bed. And maybe someday I'll tell that story, or maybe I won't. But in the meantime, I still have a mess to clean up. I have growth still to do and people to somehow pay back someday. And that's where I am now. But I'm incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to even try, and incredibly grateful for the time I got in running the bar before it closed. And even though it almost killed me, I think that it was incredibly worthwhile, and I don't regret trying. And should you ever have the resources or desire to open a gay bar, by all means try. It's going to be incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult, and you might fail, and actually you probably will fail. But regret is more expensive than failure, even if failure can be pretty damn fucking expensive sometimes. But I also say that knowing that many people don't have the luxury of even failing. But if you have the means to fail, it is one of the best ways you can grow as a person, I promise you. But here's the other thing I need to leave you with. Most of y'all will never open a gay bar. Most of y'all will never even work at a gay bar. And a lot of you may not even like going to them. I know I don't really like going to them unless I'm traveling. But if you think queer-centered businesses are important, if you think queer-owned businesses are important, if you want them around, then you need to actively go there and support them by spending your money. And I'm not saying you need to live there. But one of the things that I noticed with my bar is that I saw so many people, not just like members of the wider community, but friends of mine personally, who maybe came in once or twice while we were open because they thought we were doing well and just assumed we were going to be there whenever they felt like dropping in. But of course, our existence was constantly in peril, and that is the case for many, if not most queer-owned businesses. So don't just assume that something's going to be there. Actually make an effort to support them while they are there. And if I sit with this, it can make me feel very bitter. But bitterness isn't an emotion you grow from. It's a trap. So instead, I'm just going to advocate for you all listening to keep going to gay bars as often as you can tolerate and as often as you can afford. Well, that wraps up this incredibly long episode. Take care, bros, and I'll see you on the dance floor, hopefully.
That's why we're living it up at the butt sex disco, getting it on with all of my homos, loving it up at the butt sex disco, dancing around like I'm Yoko.